Hello everybody. So far in my Country Explained series, we only had countries which call themselves socialist. Today, this changes. We are talking about the country 40% of my subscribers are from, for the first time, the good old USA. I decided on this after I suggested it in one of my videos, and more than one person told me to do it. So, if this video is not getting many views and likes, I will stop listening to feedback and make an in-depth video about the Communist Party of Peru's shining path, splitting from the rest of the Communist Party of Peru in 1960 as a punishment, and to prove that I can make even worse performing videos than the ones you ask for. Of course, my average viewer probably knows the basics of the American government, since see above most are Americans. But if that's you, you can stick around and tell me all of my mistakes as usual, because my work is never perfect, which is a grave sin on the internet. I will explain the history of the United States, that means the start of the colonies in the New World. I'll completely gloss over the Native American genocide. Let me know if you want to see a video on that. On second thought, maybe an American, or even better, a Native American should do that. I'm a white 22-year-old from Austria. I will leave that for the better qualified people. After that, I will briefly explain the War for Independence, sometimes called a revolution by people who don't know what a revolution is. And I will use this historical context to explain some of the oddities of the American government and economy, which seem weird today, but seemed to make sense at the time, like the federal system and the electoral college. I will of course talk about the economy, which is famously a free market capitalist system with very little state involvement compared to all of Europe. Potential anarcho-capitalists watching may say the US is not a free market economy because of that, but I am going with descriptivism, so the American economy is a free market capitalist one, even at the risk of angry response videos by ANCAPs with 9 subscribers and -2 views. I will talk about the House, the Senate, the way the presidential election works, how the cabinet is chosen and what they do, as well as who enforces the laws and how they do it. I will spend less time on the territories because in the grand scheme of American politics they don't really play a part. I won't talk about the contemporary political debates either. I expect this video to remain up to date, so I will not be listing who has what post and what political opinion. I will broadly talk about the two parties for a bit, but I will aim to stay above American political debates as to not turn the comment section into a hellhole of people arguing whether to get hit with a stick or get hit with a stick held by a trans cop of color. As you can tell, even if you're new to my channel, I'm a communist. I disagree with Republicans and Democrats, and especially the way the American economy works. Despite this, I will try to remain as impartial as one can be. Of course, nobody can provide an unbiased view, but at least I admitted that I'm biased first. So, let's start with the history section. For thousands of years, the American continents and the Afro-Eurasian continents had no contact. They were not aware of each other's existence until eventually an Italian navigator tried to find Asia the other way around because he got the distances wrong. He instead landed in the Caribbean. Word spread really quickly, and the Spanish and Portuguese governments quickly declared that they owned all the land in the West. They started to systematically kill and enslave the native peoples for profit, and they spread diseases, killing 90% of the population of the Americas. Quickly there were rumors about gold in the so-called New World, so many explorers and business people invested in voyages to map and explore this New World. Among them was England. They sent settlers to track down sources of gold. They didn't find any gold, but they found fertile ground, huge forests and rivers filled to the brim with fish, all of which attracted settlers. To settle, they of course cheated and killed the native people who already lived on this land. There were also people fleeing religious and political persecution, settling in the New World, and even prisoners were sent there. out of sight, out of mind, I guess. Eventually, the settlements grew and formed their own local governments. What was notable about these governments was that they worked differently from the English ones. In England, most land was owned by noble families and worked by landless peasants. In the New World, land was only given to private individuals instead of noble families. There were no noble titles either. They had a form of democracy, but only for rich white landowners, so more like an oligarchy, if we're honest. Eventually, the colonies looked like this. They had killed and driven out pretty much all of the native peoples in this land. The relations between the colonies and the colonizers went bad around this time. By this time, England annexed Scotland and changed the name to Great Britain. You see, with the Act of Unification, Britain set up a new parliament called the House of Commons, which was summoned by the king. And upon being summoned, it would hold elections. And only certain people were allowed to vote. And that was the nobles of the land who already had the House of Lords. And all of the barons of the land. So basically, English Parliament was made to represent nobles and their families. Remember how the colonies had no nobles? That meant that they had no representatives in Parliament at all. They did not like this. Then there was a very big war that lasted 7 years and creatively called the 7 Years' War. And essentially it was England and France fighting over who owned the middle of North America. The Brits won against the odds, so Quebec and Ohio would be British. Of course, wars are expensive, and now the government in Britain needed to pay their debt, so they increased taxes. And who decided on that? The Parliament, of course. But remember how there was the House of Lords filled with the high-ranking nobles? Well, they could veto any proposal. So taxing the nobles wasn't going to happen. So they agreed to instead tax the colonies in what was now called the 13 colonies. This made sense considering that the war was mostly about the New World. The colonials didn't like this. They felt that they were treated unfairly by the British Parliament. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was formed around this time. There are history books that say that a tax on tea was the reason for the American War for Independence, but there were so many factors that it was really just the straw that broke the camel's back. Things like the Boston Massacre and the crackdown of the Royal Army on rebelling cities swung the popular opinion a lot more. Eventually they had enough and they fought for independence. Because this channel is not really about military history, I will gloss over a lot. Basically, American militias started fighting the Royal Army under the leadership of George Washington, and with a lot of support from the French. Remember, the French lost the 7 Years' War, so they supported the independence of the 13 colonies just to fuck with Britain. Eventually, of course, the American armies won and had liberty. Then they spent some time arguing about how to run the colonies. Some wanted no central government and all states to be independent, and some wanted a confederation, which they even tried but failed because no single state ever paid the taxes to the confederation government. Eventually they decided on a democratic federal republic. Democracy, of course, only for rich white landowners. And we will explain what a federal republic is in a later section. After independence, the idea of manifest destiny took hold. Basically, the idea was that the people who lived on the North American continent since the start of time were inferior to the white Christians who inhabited the East Coast. So they began to move westward, destroying nature to build cities and killing or displacing the native population, sometimes even deliberately infecting them with diseases, which falls under the definition of genocide. The intention of these settlers was to completely eradicate the native people and to plunder their land until nothing was left. While there were more settlers going westwards, they formed new states, and eventually they ran into Louisiana, which belonged to France at the time. But lucky them, the French king had spent so much money on supporting American independence that his people cut his head off and a general named Napoleon took power. And when Napoleon needed money for his wars, he sold the entire region of Louisiana to the United States. And suddenly the states doubled in size. They had more people settled there. And then, while England was busy fighting Napoleon, the United States had a great idea. They would take the rest of the British colonies in the New World, aka Canada. This was in 1812 and is appropriately called the War of 1812. Essentially, the Americans lost, so hard that the Canadians burned down the White House. But eventually there was a draw and nothing much changed. Then they bought Florida and agreed on a border with the British, which would divide American America and British America. It was just a straight line, but they still have that border. Then the Industrial Revolution started, and because America had a lot of oil on its land, a lot of industry developed there. On top of that, America has iron, coal, and more natural resources, which allowed the US to get a strong economy. Then the Americans decided that killing all natives on the continent was not enough, and that they would also kill all Mexicans. This was called the Mexican-American War, and it ended with the US looking like this. The borders on the mainland wouldn't change anymore. There was the Spanish-American War, where they got a few islands, and they had the Guano Island Act, but none of that was very major. Then the US just ignored everyone in the rest of the world and went isolationist. They took in refugees and immigrants, mainly to settle the new lands they had just stolen from the native peoples. They also began to implement slavery on a massive scale after the invention of the cotton gin, which allowed workers to make fabric from cotton plants a lot easier. And by workers, I mean slaves. They were imported from Africa because all of the native peoples already died from disease or were displaced. Because of the geography of cotton growth, the southern states grew more and more dependent on slavery, while the north industrialized. Eventually, the slave owner states rebelled because they were afraid the president would outlaw slavery, which he then did. A civil war later and slavery was no more. This would, of course, not be the end of racial discrimination felt by people of color, and this is definitely another topic I am not qualified to talk about. So, to this day, there are descendants of slave owners who fly the flag of the slavery-based white supremacist separatists. The first time the US took part in world history again was in 1917, when they joined the First World War against the German Empire. Essentially, they won. Then, after the war, there was a boom period, followed by the greatest crisis of capitalism ever. And then Germany started the Second World War, which the Americans didn't want to join until Japan attacked them, at which point they joined the Allies and the war ended. After the war, there were two superpowers, the capitalist liberal democratic USA and the state socialist democratic centralist USSR. They spent the next 40 years trying to outdo each other by fighting proxy wars to spread their own ideologies around the world. Eventually, for complicated reasons, the USSR dissolved in 1991. I have a full 44-minute video just on that event if you're interested. The American public was ecstatic. Scholars were declaring the end of history, and people around the former Eastern Bloc believed that they would get all of the nice Western consumer products now, and so on. This state of euphoria lasted until September 11, 2001, which most contemporary historians see as the start of the current political age, focused on asymmetric warfare and the war on terror. But this is where history ends and current politics begins, so I will leave it here for now. Just know that, at least right now, the USA is the main economic and especially military power, without any real rival. A lot of people predict China will overtake the USA, but I'm not a magician with card tricks. I will not tell you the future. So let's come to the economy. It's rather simple, and you're probably familiar with the basic concept: free market capitalism. Things are produced by private individuals or by private industry belonging to private individuals. And then they are sold and bought by more private individuals. This is, of course, different to every country we had so far, which by and large had industry and trade controlled by the state, which claimed to represent all people in the factories, or directly by the people who work in the factories. This means that there couldn't be one person owning a factory with 100 employees. The employees ran the business. Capitalism specifically allows single individuals to employ many others. I have a lot of objections to this, exemplified by my video on the labor theory of value. Essentially, the Marxist view is that if you have a single person running a factory and taking the profits, they are incentivized or even required to pay the workers less than they produced. That's what profit is. Marxists believe this is unjust. Anarchists also have an issue with private industry because it gives single individuals power over others by setting their wages and their off days and even firing them and taking their livelihoods away. The USA developed this form of capitalism as a response to their conditions after the war for independence. The ideas of the free market were pretty new, and the US was the first country to universally apply these principles of private ownership and trade. And to be fair, it was very profitable for them. Sure, the current American economy was built on slavery and exploitation, but it's big. Of course, most political scientists agree that a little regulated market economy like this ends up with monopolies and unequal wealth distribution. This is just because if two businesses compete, one of them wins and the other one goes out of business, at which point the winner expands to take in the customers of the loser. Repeat until there is only one business left, at which point it no longer has to compete and can raise the prices to anything without consumers even having an alternative to choose from, effectively destroying all advantages of a market system. This is why, before the Second World War, the government intervened in the economy to bust monopolies, forcing them to split into multiple businesses that had to compete again. Of course, this was not the first time the American state was involved in the economy. They do a lot of things to influence the way the economy develops. For example, using tariffs. A tariff is a tax on a foreign product. For example, there is a tax on motor vehicles. So Germans need to pay extra tax when selling their cars in the USA. This was established to make American cars cheaper for the buyer, to keep the American automotive industry alive and let all the people working in it keep their jobs. The state, of course, also takes taxes from businesses and individuals. They tax a wide array of things. If you work for someone and you get your wage, you pay a certain percent of it in tax. If you run a business and make a profit, you pay a tax. If you buy something at a grocery store, you pay a tax. All these taxes seem too high to Americans. But curiously, Europeans have way higher taxes by comparison, and they don't complain nearly as much. This is of course because compared to Europe, the American federal government is very weak. It does very little to influence the economy or the lives of the people. In Europe, almost all countries have state-run health insurance that covers everyone. The United States doesn't have that at all. There is a mandate that employers with a certain amount of workers need to offer health insurance, but that leaves out a lot of people who are self-employed, like I am. So, for example, while in Austria 99.9% of people have health insurance, in the US it's only around 85%. But of course, there are Americans that say that this makes them more free. I will not get into the debate, I'm just pointing out that the United States stands out as one of the only major industrialized nations not to offer health insurance. But, of course, the United States isn't some pure market capitalist country either. This state does lots of things to influence the economy and the lives of people. There are those who think this is bad. Let's say I disagree with them. This state, for example, make sure people don't put anything harmful in food. That's the job of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, which right now is mostly known for tracking the progression of the coronavirus. But they also check for foodborne illness. They do this to make sure there isn't some great public health risk originating anywhere in the US. The Federal Drug Administration, FDA, is tasked with making sure medicines that are given to people are safe. It was given this power after there were some major health incidents caused by untested medications. The government also regulates industries. For example, the Federal Aviation Administration approves of planes and pilots to make sure that there are no plane-related accidents. Likewise, it was established after many crashes. And of course, there are all sorts of codes on how to build a building fire safe and what emergency equipment who needs to own, introduced after horrible accidents that usually killed many people. There is also the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, usually called OSHA, which has a lot of regulations about how employers need to treat workers. This was created after workers were exposed to horrible conditions in the 1800s. They had children worked, locked emergency exits to prevent people from leaving early. Occupational hazards were completely ignored, and so on. As you can tell, all these administrations were only established to deal with specific problems. In the start of the US, they had none of these agencies. They evolved because they were needed for the public good. And another thing that developed this way was infrastructure. Roads and such used to be owned by the states. But when more and more people got cars, the federal government eventually noticed that they needed a more modern and unified way to manage infrastructure. This is when they built federal highways, usually called interstate highways. Their true and official purpose was to connect military bases across the states, but as a side effect they made every form of travel or trade between the states a lot more efficient. The interesting part is that the federal government still owns and funds these highways. See, the reason is that in a lot of Europe, like Austria for example, highways were privatized by the government in the 90s. So in this case, the US actually has more government control than Austria. Of course, that control comes with costs. Paying for a road isn't very hard, so they just made lots of really big, nice roads. And now these roads are getting damaged, and someone needs to pay for this. And the states refuse to pay for it since it's a federal system. But the federal government really doesn't like to spend money on infrastructure, so there is a dangerous lack of funding for maintenance. This extends beyond roads. The same issue exists for dams and bridges. There is a dangerous lack of oversight compared to other countries. Another thing about the American infrastructure is the rail network. And the unique thing is that it was never owned by the state. It was always private. In countries like the UK and Germany, they had state-run railroads but privatized them in the 80s and 90s. Other countries like Austria and France kept the railroads under government control, which meant that the railroads don't need to be 100% profitable. So even small stations that will never make a profit get regular service. This, among other reasons, is why American public rail transport barely exists, at least compared to Europe. There are many more state organs doing many more things, but the last one I am mentioning is the Fed, aka the Federal Reserve. I mention it not because it's special, but because there are so many conspiracy theories around it. Matter of fact, I made a video about one 2 years ago. Basically, the Fed is a national bank. That's not called a national bank. You see, back in the old days before the Fed, there were only private banks. They would loan money, get the money back with interest, let people open bank accounts and so on. And because of economics, they could always loan out more money than they actually had in their vault. Which means if a few people wanted to take their money out at the same time, that was no problem. But if too many wanted their money back at once, the bank wouldn't have anything left and go bankrupt. And a lot of people wouldn't get their money from their bank account, which made people, even the ones who were customers of another bank, get worried that their bank will collapse. So they tried to get all of their money out of those accounts, which caused a bank rush and even more banks to collapse and then a full-on economic crisis. There is an obvious way to solve this: prevent banks from loaning out more than they have. This is exactly what libertarians propose. They want banks to only give out as much money as they have in gold reserves. This is called the gold standard. The issue with this, at least to capitalist economics, is that this severely constricts the growth of the economy. The purpose of a bank is to loan money to people to start businesses or build houses, which grows the economy. If you only let them lend as much as they have in the deposits of individuals, they can only hand out so many loans. But if you allow them to hand out 10 times more, you in theory get 10 times more economic expansion, because there are more loans to fund economic activity. This is why every single modern capitalist nation allows banks to loan out more than they have in reserves. It's called fractional reserve banking, because they only need to keep a fraction in reserves. So what is the solution? If we want them to keep loaning more than they have, how do we prevent them from collapsing if there's a run on the banks? Well, a government-backed organization that is tasked with loaning banks money when there's a run on the bank. So they would hand money to the private banks so it doesn't collapse and cause an economic crisis. And then once the people stop panicking and the bank makes a profit again, they pay back the loan to the government agency. In almost all countries, that agency is called a central bank. Americans oppose the state-run banks, so they call it the Federal Reserve, which is totally different. The members of the board of the Fed are selected by the president. There are people who say the Fed is a private bank. They are wrong. The Fed also regulates the money supply by printing new money and destroying old money, which controls inflation. As mentioned before, libertarians have a big issue with printing money, and that is not backed by gold. So naturally, they hate the Fed. They think it's money printing is what causes inflation. Now, this video is really long already, so I can't really explain how inflation works. I promised a video on that topic over 2 years ago. It's still on the list though. So basically, the common belief is that inflation is bad because it lowers the value of money, which is correct in this case. But inflation is needed for a free market economy for reasons that are complicated. People also believe that printing money causes inflation, which would make the Fed an inflation machine that needs to be stopped. But this is not really true. Remember how the US government gave millions to banks in 2008? Well, that money came from the Fed, and they printed it. So, by the increased supply logic, giving these millions would have caused money to be less valuable because the supply increased. But if we look at the graph of American inflation, we see that in 2008 to 2010, the inflation was negative. The money was more valuable after the payouts. Again, the reason is too complicated for this video. Just know that it's not as simple as the Fed makes money and prices increase. It's very complicated. So I believe that this is more than enough about how the economy of the United States is organized and regulated. Let's come to the big 3 parts of a modern government. I'm sure you know them. They are the legislature, who make laws, the executive that makes people follow the laws, and the judiciary that interprets the laws. Let's arbitrarily start with the legislature, aka the law writers. The place that makes laws is called the Congress, or the United States Congress to use the full official title. You would think it's as simple as that there is a building called Congress that has people meeting who agree on laws, but of course it's not that simple. You see, the Congress is actually made up of 2 different bodies called chambers that need to agree on the laws, which at this stage are called bills, by the way. They are the House of Representatives, often shortened to House, and the Senate, which isn't shortened because it only has 2 syllables. The House contains representatives which are chosen more or less as you expect a democratic parliament to be chosen. More or less, if you look at it. The way it works is that the government assigns each state a certain amount of seats, which are always 435 in total, mostly based on population. the algorithm they use for that is very complicated. And when I say very complicated, I mean that there's a 42-minute video by CGP Grey explaining it. So yeah, the states get seats. And then the state decides on as many congressional districts as they have seats. And then each district elects a representative who then gets to send to the House to represent the interests of their district, not their state. In praxis, it's the interest of their party, but in theory, it's their district. Then there's, of course, the Senate. See, the House represents the will of the districts, and in theory, the people. The Senate is the second part of this. It doesn't represent the interests of electors, but of the states. This is why every state, no matter how large or small, has 2 representatives in Senate, making a total of 100, since there are 50 states. The senators are elected by the people in state elections, just like the representatives in the House. So you may be wondering what the point of this is. Why are there 2 bodies that work together in this government? And the answer lies with the previous video of mine, but I will repeat it for the sake of increasing watch time. Another country used the same system, and I believe it makes more sense when looking at that one. So, which country was the one that used the exact same government structure as the good old freedom-loving USA, no one less than her old enemy, the Soviet Union? You see, the Soviet Union was not just one state. It was a collection of states. Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and many more. The issue was that Russians outnumbered everyone. So, if they just held parliamentary elections by the people, like the House in America, then the Russians would outweigh everyone else, and it would disadvantage the other states. So they had a second chamber, in which all member states of the Soviet Union had an equal say. So the Russians couldn't just decide to send all nuclear waste to Estonia or something like that. The chamber in which the states are equal makes sure regions with smaller populations aren't ruled by places with higher population. So that is the purpose. The Senate makes the states equal so that the states with higher population don't force things on those with smaller populations. I explained it using the Soviet Union because it instinctively makes sense that there are cases in which the interests of Ukrainians don't match the interests of Russians. But why do that with states? If you're American, you likely already know how opposing the state governments are sometimes, but if you aren't American, like myself and the statistical majority of my audience, this can seem weird. Like, what makes the states so different? They're all Americans, right? And yes, of course, they are. But different states have widely different geographies, populations, and economies. To have one parliament to make laws for all those cases and regions would be nearly impossible. Especially if you remember that the states were founded 250 years ago. So the states exist to be more local and flexible. They write their own laws and regulations specific to their conditions and the wishes of their population. And there's a second reason smaller states are protected by the Senate. Back when the states were 13, the US looked like this. And as you can tell, there are some larger states like Virginia and Georgia, and small ones like Delaware and Rhode Island. And the small ones believed that they would be completely ignored by the larger, more populous ones in the future. So they demanded the establishment of the Senate, which needs to approve laws written by the House. This, of course, means the US is not a pure democracy, since some voters, like the ones in the smaller states, are overrepresented in the Senate. If you've ever talked to someone and they said, the US isn't a democracy, it's a federal republic, this is what they meant. They are wrong, of course, the US is both a type of democracy and a federal republic, but whatever. So that is why sometimes even laws the majority agrees with are blocked. 60% of Americans can support something, and then 60% of the House would support it and pass the bill, but it would only pass if half of the Senate approves, which isn't a given just because a majority of the country wants it. So now that we know how the Congress works and why the House and Senate are the way they are, what do they do all day? Well, the main function is what I was talking about all the time: passing laws. These are federal laws. They apply in all of America, all states, all territories, as well as planes and ships registered there. As such, they only pass major legislation. For example, a law about restricting speed within a city limit for pollution control is not something the Congress would write. Details like that are left to the states. Federal laws are only used for things that need to be universal in the country, like, for example, access to healthcare or a right to own property. They also write bills that declare how much the US government will spend on all types of things. Armies, hospitals, rockets but made by private capitalists, education and so on. They pass this spending bill once a year, and there are two things that are constant about it. It's a huge argument every time, and the military budget is increased. Besides that, the Congress also has the power to impeach public officials. This means removing them from office in case they do something really illegal. I am mentioning this incidentally and totally not because of any recent politicians that were impeached twice. I say impeached, but you see, the impeachment passed the House but was blocked by the Senate. There you see the dual structure again. Of course, in theory, this whole system sounds great. The people vote for their congressional representative and their state representative, and all these representatives vote on the exact interests of their constituents or state, and they collectively agree on the laws that are best for the nation as a whole. And that's how it was intended. But of course, in reality, there are political parties. Two of them, Democrats and Republicans. So a lot of the time, the person to get a seat in the House is not the person that best represents the congressional district, but rather a candidate chosen by the party in advance. There are, of course, two candidates, one by each party, but that's really it. Independents don't get enough votes, so it's always a choice between two party-picked candidates. Of course, sometimes the candidates are selected by the party based on polls, but they can select whoever. And people are more likely to vote in line with their party than with who would better represent them. So anyone besides centrists has only one real choice. This makes for a very frustrating political system. This same thing is true in the House. The candidates are selected by the party, usually following polls, and the people have the choice between a Republican and a Democrat. And sometimes an independent who gets 4% of the votes and hurts the party they're closest to. The party structure also means that both the House and the Senate often don't represent their voters but rather their party, which ironically enough is the same issue the USSR and China had, for different reasons though. Enough of the lawmakers now. Let's have a look at those who turn the laws into praxis, the executive. Most people, when they hear executive, think about the police, and the police is of course a core part of law enforcement in a country, but the tasks of the executive are broader than that, and they include more people, like, for example, the president and vice president. We will get into their jobs right after we talk about the presidential election. Unlike most other countries, the United States doesn't have a national popular vote to determine a president. Instead, every state is given a certain amount of votes, which happens to be the same amount as of seats they get in the House, plus 2. These votes are really people, representatives. The reason is that the people don't elect the president, the representatives do. So every state has a set amount of representatives called electors, who then all meet in Washington and vote on the president. The electors usually vote in line with the people who won the vote in their home state. I say usually because there are states in which the electors can just vote for whoever. Of course, if a state has 55 seats and let's say 60% of the people vote for Democrats, you would expect the Democrats to get 60% of those 55 seats and the Republicans to get the other 40%. With the exception of 2 states, that doesn't happen. That means if a party wins 51% in a state, they are almost certain to get all the electoral college votes there. So candidates straight up don't care about states that are certain to vote for them or the enemy. Instead, they do all of the advertisements in so-called swing states, in which neither side has a clear majority. So there's only one question left about the presidential election. how are these candidates determined? Well, in theory, anyone can run for president, and they often do, but like everything in American politics, if you want to get somewhere, you need to be in a party. And to make sure that they don't spoil the vote, every party nominates only one candidate per election. And how does a party agree on a candidate to nominate? Well, in theory, they could select them, however, and in practice they still sometimes do, but they hold so-called primaries and caucuses, which are unofficial elections held by the parties in states. Depending on which of their candidates is the most popular one, they decide on their candidate for president. And all going well, they are then elected by the Electoral College and take over the executive branch of the government. But what do they do there all day? Well, let's come to the presidential powers and responsibilities. Officially, the job of the president is to enforce the laws passed by Congress. Note that the president doesn't enforce laws made by states, only by the federal government. In practice, this means the president can order around law enforcement agencies and the army. The president can also write his own presidential decrees, which are like laws in a way, but they can be removed by the next president or by a high court. The president can also pardon criminals, which, I'm not sure if it's a good idea to let the executive override the judiciary, but whatever. The vice president's job is to take over the jobs of the president if they died, and to break ties in the Senate if they happen to vote exactly 50-50 on something. As we discussed before, Congress passes all kinds of bills. The spending bill, laws that promise new highways and schools, and a lot of other federal projects. But of course, Congress isn't the one to call up a construction company and negotiate with them for what price to build the highway. Having such a large body do negotiations would be wildly ineffective. So, the job to make these things happen lies with the president. So the president's job is to do whatever Congress agreed on. Build power plants, hospitals, military bases, environmental protection, and so on. But of course, likewise, giving all these jobs to the president would be ineffective and overwhelming. So the president appoints people to lead different government departments that do these jobs. There are 15 different secretaries in the cabinet of the president. They can be chosen and fired by the president at will, which is a lot of power and control. So, if the Congress says that there is a need to be more hospitals, that is the job of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. If Congress says we need to spend more on the military and go into debt for it, that is the job of the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Defense. Every secretary runs an entire department that is made up of smaller government agencies which do the job of both enforcing the law and implementing changes foreseen by Congress. Note that all these secretaries still only work on federal level. They're responsible for things decided by Congress, not the state governments. As such, even the law enforcement ministry, which by the way is called Ministry of Justice, still only enforces federal law. For this, it uses agencies like the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The minister that stood out to me was the Minister of Defense, because their department isn't just a branch of the government, it's the military. In theory, the president always has the last say over what the army will do. And in this case, when I say army, I mean Army, Air Force and Navy. The president is called Commander-in-Chief for that reason. But usually, the control of the army is delegated to the Minister of Defense, who runs the Ministry of Defense, which is split up in 3 departments, Army, Air Force and Navy. These departments are run by a mix of generals who climbed the ranks of the forces and people appointed and hired by the defense minister or president. We talked about how the executive around the president only enforces federal laws and that Congress only makes federal laws. So what about everything else? That is a subject for the state. And the state works like a mini federal government. They have a state legislature elected by the people, and they have a governor who is likewise elected, who is tasked with enforcing the laws in their state by appointing people to law enforcement and other ministries. Literally just the president, but on a smaller scale. Let us now come to the most boring branch of the government. And yes, I'm being harsh on it, but frankly it's the least exciting one. Their job is to interpret the law. the judiciary. You see, Congress or state governments will write laws, and sometimes two laws will conflict with each other, or they're open for interpretation. If two people disagree on the interpretation, you need a court with the judge to decide who's in the right. There are 3 different layers of courts. Local courts, which serve the county. These do things like traffic and zoning violations. Then there are the state courts, which deal with things the state is responsible for, like murder. And then there are cases for the Supreme Court, which deal with federal law and the Constitution. In the United States, just like every modern government I can think of, you can't be punished for a crime without being given the chance to defend yourself in court. For this, you will get a lawyer provided by the state if you can't afford one. In these cases, there may be a jury deciding guilt, or it may just be a judge. It depends on whether you're accused of being negligent and someone's slipping on a wet floor in your restaurant, or like killing somebody. Let's look at the Supreme Court. It's seated in Washington and has 9 members selected by Congress. They deal with matters of constitutional and federal law. So, for example, if someone made a law decreeing that you can't own a gun anymore, then you could drag that state in front of the High Court and argue that it's violating your right to the Second Amendment, and you would almost definitely win. It's important to know that nobody ends up in the High Court for murder. That is a job for the state courts. The Supreme Court only sets precedent in landmark cases, which means the High Court makes decisions on controversial issues, and all lower courts then follow that ruling, which means the justice system is more uniform to prevent arbitrary decisions. Now, state courts work differently. This is because the Constitution allows the state to select their state court members however they want to. So, some have a popular election, some have the judges be elected by the state government, and so on. No 2 states are alike, so I really can't say much. I just know that the vast majority of criminal and civil cases end up in state courts. And in accordance with the majority of people in prison are in state prisons. Every level of the courts has their own prison system. There's federal prisons for people who broke federal law or were arrested by the FBI, like the Unabomber. But almost every murderer or scam artist ends up in state prisons. The last part of the American prison population isn't in prison. They're in jail, a county jail to be specific. The difference is that a prisoner is there to serve a sentence, while someone in jail is just waiting for their trial. Local courts are even less uniform than the state courts, and there are way more. They're mostly elected by people, though about 70% run unopposed. Sort of like in the USSR. Their jobs are the small things like traffic violations and public drunkenness. This is why there are no county prisons, because for these kinds of violations, usually there is no prison sentence, and if there is, they will send the inmates to state prison instead. Of course, in theory, county jail is only until your court date, but because the American justice system is completely understaffed, it can take 5 years or so to get your trial. Admittedly, that number is from state courts, not local ones, but it's pretty bad. Not to mention that you can pay to get out of jail, which advantages rich people, and I don't like. So yeah, that was the history, the economy, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary of the United States, just for you. I hope you learned something or found a mistake, which I no doubt made, and I will receive in the comments as I always do. In conclusion, I would say the United States government is a deliberate balance between the interests of the states and the interests of the population of the whole country. Whether this is good or not depends on your preferred type of government. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you even more for liking and commenting. And thank you the most for anyone who donates on Patreon or subscribes. It's really helpful now that I go to university and stuff. This has been the longest video in ages, so let's hope the average watch time is high. Thanks for watching, and an extra thanks to Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hart, Xander Corbus, Attila Nemes, Carousel, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Caruselli, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gabby Gita, Hardington Gerdington, Josh C., Klastrup, Lilith Kraft, Marmuka Tsilauri, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Pope, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef and Trey.